There we go. So, Ed, does this work? Or you're going to have to raise it up, I guess, a little bit there for me to be seen online. So, everybody, thanks, band, for that. I asked the band to do that. It's one of our favorite Peter Mayer songs. And it was kind of fun because DeAndrea, thank you for your words and for your prayer. After she said her prayer, she came up after, and then Brad started that song. She said, strange song to follow that prayer. Well, you know me. It's perfect. Perfectly fits. Let's see here. This is always awkward. Yep. There we go. We'll get to this idea of what it means to be in the dark. I love the line, make a dangerous tryst with mystery. We generally try to avoid mystery, right? We generally try to avoid the dark, so to speak. We generally try to not go to the place sometimes we need to go to deal with the stuff we need to deal with personally, right? So we pay therapists to force us to go there, or a priest, or lucky you, me. Yeah. When I'm on a flight, when I used to fly and I used to travel around as a storyteller, one of the things that I've shared in here is how, when I was traveling as a storyteller, I would tell people, because you're sitting next to them and they go, what do you do for a living, right? And so you're always like, I don't have the benefit of saying, I'm an engineer, I'm a doctor, I'm an architect, I'm a construction worker, a nurse. We don't have that. I don't have that luxury. I have to look over and go, I'm a storyteller. Because that's what I did. I traveled around the country. And then the inevitable question would come back. You know what it would be? Really? They pay you to do that? That's the first question. And then the second question is always, can you tell me a story? Right? So always follows up with that, which is always awkward when you're right on the spot in the plane, face-to-face with somebody, and they're saying, tell a story. Usually you just come up with a joke. After a while, though, of course, I came back to working in the local church. I came back here 8 years ago to be involved with this group. Now when I traveled around, of course, you know what would happen, because then it was the other awkward question. Well, what do you do for a living? Well, I'm a pastor. I'm a minister. And two things immediately happen. Either they look at you and they go, oh, how nice. And then they go back to their reading or something else, anything to move, to get distracted. Or the other thing they say is, really, I don't go to church near as often as I should. And then it gets confessional. And then if you invite the confessional, then it becomes more of a counseling session or something like that. So what I've decided to is now when I travel and when people ask me what I do, I say I'm a theologian. And then it's just a blank look. What is that? And then I say, I study God. Which again, completely makes no sense. Right? They look at me and they go, how does God feel about that? And I'm like, I don't know. That's what I'm trying to find out. That's what we do. If you're a person of faith, if you're a person of spiritual inclination, we do theology. Now, you don't think about it, just as DeAndre was saying there at the beginning. We don't typically think of ourselves as thinking about theology. We do. Everything we act out of faith regarding, everything is somehow associated with what we think about who or what or how or if God is. It just is there. It's an assumption. A lot of us just move about with that assumption without even giving it a second thought. Some of us move about that assumption with a sense of guardedness, a sense of defensiveness. Some of us move about with a sense of comfort. But thinking theologically is really something different. I'm going to give you some ideas about what that is, but to do that, I want to tell you a quick story. So a young woman came home with her fiancé, and so she comes in and she introduces her fiancé to her parents. And her dad takes the young man aside, and they go off into the study, get a drink, and he's going to get to know the guy. So he says, tell me what you do. And the guy says, well, I study theology. And the father says, really? Well, what are your plans? How do you plan to make a living? And the young man says, well, I'm studying really hard to be a good theologian, and I know that God will provide. And the father says, yeah, that's great. But now, do you have money to pay for my daughter's wedding ring? And he says, well, I'm working really hard at it, and I know that God will provide. And the father says, do we have a problem over here? And the father says, do you need a moment? There you go. It's just, sorry to bring up a touchy subject. So the father says, well, how are you going to buy the wedding ring? And he says, I know that God will provide. So then the father asks again, he says, yeah. But, my daughter's going to work, you're going to work. How are you going to contribute to the future of this house? Buying the house, helping her, the two of you working together, and then providing for one another and for the family. How will you be a part of that? How will you contribute to that? And again, he said, I'm going to work really hard and study really hard and be a good theologian, and God will provide. And no matter what the father said in the conversation, the son always came back with the same answer, and God will provide. Well, after he finally left, the father went in and talked to the mother, and they kind of closed out the evening. They were in the bedroom talking. She said, well, what's he like? And he said, well, I got bad news and I got good news, the father said. And the father said, well, the bad news is the idealist doesn't have a plan and he doesn't have a job. But the good news is he thinks I'm God. Okay. The Gospel of John was written sometime in the early second century, maybe in the mid-second century, and it was written very different from the other three Gospels, the Synoptics, right? The Synoptics, Mark, Luke, and Matthew, are very similar. They parallel. They have their distinctive differences because they come from different communities of Jews and Jewish Christians. But the Gospel of John was written about 100 years or so after Jesus, and it has a whole different point of view, and it's dealing with a whole different situation. And by then, 2 generations or so after Jesus, things have changed. Thinking about who God is, thinking about who Jesus was and who Jesus is now, all of these things have changed. You have to read this gospel with that in mind. So some people call it very much of a mystic gospel. So here's how it begins. I love that it's kind of a creation story. John, the first chapter. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life. And the life was the light of all people, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Writers and speakers and preachers were typically taught to talk about what we know, right? If you're writing something, somebody will say, write about what you know. If you're going to perform, somebody says, well, perform what you know. You shared your story, which was really funny and beautiful, and thank you for sharing. We're supposed to share what we know, so I'm going to talk about God, which seems a little absurd and presumptuous, if I'm going to be honest with you. Now, certainly we know preachers who will be happy to stand up here and tell you everything that they know about God, which should cause you to wonder a little bit. When I start talking about the same way that I know other things, like the same way we hear people talk about God in a certain kind of gender or a certain kind of way, his place of residence, his people, who are his enemies, that oftentimes are our enemies, and about who's included in his kingdom and who's excluded from the kingdom, when we do that, we make claims about his characteristics. Omnipotence, omnipresence, wrath and love, perfection and divinity. And we talk about him about as casually as if we were talking about a neighbor or a new car. Think about the way you talk about your neighbor or their new car, or maybe your favorite laundry detergent. And think about the way you talk about God. Now, it seems a little strange. It seems maybe like I'm being a little bit caustic here, but I think sometimes we have this all too familiar orientation with the divine, and you got to wonder, really? Are we all that in control of everything? In fact, I think sometimes we speak of God and lace our Facebook memes and inspirational well wishes and sermons with God language that is so casual and so familiar that it renders God a kind of tourist attraction because it's so familiar and it's so comforting, and it should be, and yet maybe we need to think about it as well. Just what are we thinking about when we find God as a comfort only? So for the most part, what you see on Facebook posts and what we often write or wish one another, or what is often talked about in sermons, it seems a little obvious and maybe comforting in the way that if you watch a favorite movie, it can be comforting in the same way. So I already assume that I'm not that comforting at the moment. Because I want to think with you about theology. Theology is thinking about God. It's not determining what God is. It's not saying this is God and I know better. It's thinking about God. So whatever we think or feel about the word God, it seems that the last association that we should be making that should come to mind is the word obvious. I need to say that again. Whatever we're thinking or however we're talking about God, it seems like the last word that we should associate with thinking theologically or thinking about God is the word obvious. I mean, we're talking about God. Is it that obvious? I think about one of my favorite encounters that I have almost every week with one of my favorite employees at a local brewery. I walk in. We've gotten to be chums, pals now. But he always looks at me and he always says, "So I guess you've seen in the paper what your God and his hateful people are up to now." And it's always the same old cliched, bearded kind of Monty Python God with his crowd of self-centered, mean-spirited minions judging everyone else. This is the way he thinks about God. And I guess this is the way he thinks I think about God, because if I talk about God, I'm talking about the obvious. And then I think about his statement, and I think, well, with the Christians that he often meets who talk about God and Jesus with that same kind of familiarity and that same kind of superficial enthusiasm that they use to talk about their favorite sports team, then I shouldn't be surprised that that's the way they think about God too. The late UCC minister and professor Culver Nelson wrote this. I don't know that we have this one up as a quote yet, but he wrote, "The word God itself is a very slender word that simply covers our shivering ignorance." A very slender word when you think about it, that's really doing more to cover what we're afraid to go to sometimes. Are we really afraid to think theologically if it means really thinking about it? Are we willing to go to that dark place, if you will? We're born into a religious culture or family or tradition, and then we're converted into that tradition. And then usually what happens is we end up with this. The next slide here. This is the right one. Yeah, there you go. Welcome to the faith now. Here's your complimentary box outside of which you should never, ever again think. Although I like this one. This next one is also one of my favorites. Theology boxes for sale. Be careful which one that you pick. You'll be in it the rest of your life. Now, we laugh, but many of us know that's exactly where we were. Maybe some of us still are. Thinking theologically is the challenge to be dynamic in our relationship with whatever God is, however God is, whatever the divine is. Thinking theologically is the challenge to live dynamically in relationship to that. Improvisationally, if you will, but dynamically. Now, I'm going to give you two words here to think about. The word idol and the word symbol. Now, I wanted to bring up the next picture. There you go. You're reading the sign there, right? So I just thought that was fun. Some of you actually have been to that church. I want to think with you about two words. The first word is idol. The second word is symbol. Now, what is an idol? The word idol literally means static object. It means emotionally and psychologically that which we desire, which we cannot live without. I mean, almost like addiction. It is that which we really deeply have to have. That's idol. Now, idolatry, of course, is something in the Bible that is chastised, spoken against, or warned against, that sort of thing. We know, from the Bible, from our growing up in the faith, idolatry is a bad thing, right? Think about that. An idol is that which we so need to keep static, unchanging. What's a symbol? You say a symbol's not real. An idol is real. Well, an idol is real because it's projection out of yourself. I mean, it is your projection, right? So it's real in that sense. A symbol, we say it's not real, it's symbolic. And yet, what does it speak to? You read a piece of poetry, suddenly you're inspired. You read a novel like that kid once I encountered at a library who was reading a Harry Potter book and got mad at me because I was talking about fairy tales and folk tales, and he said, they're not real. And I said, tell me about your book on Harry Potter. And he says, well, I love it. And he started describing the scenes to me. And then he started getting excited. And I said, I can see you're really emotional about it. And he said, yeah. He's like 12 years old. I said, well, I bet you get scary at times. He says, it gets really scary at times. I said, I bet you even feel your heart racing. He says, yeah, because it's scary. I said, wait a minute. Your heart's racing? He said, yeah. I said, but it's not real. Is your heart racing real? I said, is your heart racing real? He says, yeah, I guess. And I said, so is the story true? And he looked up at his mom, and mom went, Thinking theologically requires us to get out of our idolatry. You get that? Thinking theologically requires us to get out of our idolatry and to get into a dynamic relationship with God as presence, God as love, God as sacredness, God as mystery. Now, how we do that in a minute I'll talk about. So I think we want to keep those two words in mind. And then the other thing I want to think about is this idea of power and empowerment. Now, empowerment is... power, if we think of God as omnipotent, what we think of God is as having this power, all being all-powerful. If we think of God as empowering, that's more about relationship. So when we think of God as being all-powerful, as DeAndrea brought up that wonderful illustration about the family that she was working with and the woman whose child had died, and the challenge of that, it's similar to your own story, Wynn, and the challenge with that. When we think of power and omnipotence, we think of, well, something has to come in and fix things, right? When we think of empowerment, we think of, how do I deal with this? How do I live through this? We are empowered through God's presence in the world, through the way in which we improvise, and we are empowered to improvise with people around us. And we see the doctors coming in, and we see the nurses coming in, and their hands are up in the air. And then we see others coming in, and everyone is working with the deepest sense of love and knowledge, and still something's not working, and so we move to the next thing. We yes and even in the darkness. So I know we're running out of time here, so I want to conclude with a couple of quick thoughts. Martin Buber had these wonderful ideas about how we think about God. He called it the I-thou relationship. Martin Buber was the Jewish theologian in the 20th century. When we relate to one another as things that we expect or label or control, we have in our box. Like if you tell me who you are and what you do, I already know who you are. I already know what you do. Sometimes I get mad at somebody because they cut me off on the highway or because they do something else or because I see something on Facebook. I already know who they are. I already know what they do, right? We try to control things because it's our natural way of being. Martin Buber called that I-it. He said we relate to one another, we relate to things as objects we define and therefore have under our control. We do that to what we think is God. We do that to our own theology sometimes. But I-thou, he said, is a different way of understanding. I-thou sees that the world is imbued with this mystery, as Paul the Apostle said, the ground of our very being, which is love. As the First John is the letter to the epistle to John, first letter epistle to John, said, God is love. And if we say that we are of God, then we love. If we say we do not love, then we're not of God. God is love. So when we think of I-thou as opposed to I-it, we are entering into a mysterious relationship that says, you're empowered and imbued with God. I am, this mystery is, this tragedy is, this difficulty and this hope and this possibility, it is all a part of whatever God is. But what we know is that when we participate in it, when we engage in it with one another, when we connect, we are doing something mysterious that begins to bring us another opportunity, a wider possibility. That's what improv is all about, right? The yes and. The hardest thing I had with improvisation when I was taking improv classes, not just with Wynn, but over here at the four-day weekend, the hardest thing I had was this idea that I couldn't predict what the outcome was. because I had a better ending. But it didn't go that way. And what happens? I'm literally upended. I got nothing because I'd already made up my mind. The only way to enter into the mystery of God's presence and love, whatever that might be, is to enter with vulnerability, is to enter with openness, and to enter with a sense of trust and curiosity that says, how can I give life to this life? How can I bring life to this moment? So let's go through the last question here, the last quote here, because I think these are a couple of good quotes that I just want to highlight. The problem is that many of the people in need of saving are in the churches. And at least part of what they need saving from is the idea that God sees the world the same way they do. Idolatry. Go to the next quote. I love this. All right, so this is Karen Armstrong, wonderful scholar, writer who wrote the book God, an Autobiography. It's an interesting read. It's a heavy read, but I love what she says here. Theology is or should be a species of poetry, which read quickly and encountered in a hubbub of noise makes no sense. You have to open yourself to a poem with a quiet, receptive mind. You have to, in the same way that you might listen to a difficult piece of music, if you seize upon a poem and try to extort its meaning before you are ready, it remains opaque. If you bring your own personal agenda to bear upon it, it will close itself like a clam because you have denied its unique and separate identity, its inviolate holiness. Part of our spiritual practice, and I talk about spiritual practice in here all the time, saying thank you. Yeah, y'all can come on up, band, if you want. No, you're already up here. Just wait here. Part of what I talk about spiritual practice is this idea, we say thank you in spite of whatever's happening. We just start practicing a way of being in the presence of gratitude. Last week we talked about in the presence of when things trouble us, like with Scripture, if we don't understand it, whatever we're having trouble with, we set it aside. If we don't agree with it, we set that aside. If we do agree with it, we set that aside. So today, what I want you to think about as we think about theology and doing theology is this idea that we open ourselves up to the symbolic. And the only way to do that is to set aside what we know, what we think we know, but instead to be present to what might happen. The last quote that I wanted to share with you is what I think the New Testament is all about. I've shared this before. Linda and I have talked about this. My wife, Linda, also an associate here. The path of shalom seems to be what the Old Testament has always been about. If you look at the whole story, it's always been about justice and balance and harmony and right relationship with one another. And how do you get there when other people can be so bad? Or other people can be so off base or so wrong? Or how do you get there in the midst of tragedy? Or how do you get there in the midst of questions? God is about this path of shalom, this kingdom, this interrelatedness that we live in the midst of, and how we conspire with each moment to find it. Now, conspire has a weird phrase, a weird word, a weird meaning to it, this idea that we're doing something sneaky, but conspire really means to be with life, to bring life, spire, to bring breath. How do we then bring breath to each moment, improvise, if you will, in order to find it? And when we don't find it, then how do we offer the yes so that someone else might find the opportunity to and? Amen.